When Keith Pepper bought a chain of print newspapers back in 2020, he received an email from a columnist at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that basically asked if he was crazy. But Keith had a plan for taking a company that generated 98% of its revenue from print advertising and converting it into a digital-first media company. And he's done just that. Today, Rough Draft Atlanta generates 27% of its revenue from digital ads, and it managed this feat without seeing a significant decline in print advertising. This has allowed Keith to reinvest in the business by hiring more journalists, and is now stronger than ever. In a recent interview, Keith explained how he consolidated all the newspapers under a single brand, his strategy for attracting online ads, and why he's avoided placing his content behind a paywall. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. By the way, have you ever wondered how I monetize this show? It's entirely reliant on subscriptions to my Substack newsletter. When you subscribe, you're able to book a half-hour introductory phone call with me. You also receive subscriber-only interviews with some of the world's most successful media entrepreneurs. Support the work I do here by subscribing at simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. And finally, if you're on the lookout for interviews with the world's most successful media entrepreneurs about how they built their businesses, then this is the show for you. So take a few moments to hit the subscribe button down below. Okay, let's jump into the interview. Hey, Keith, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Simon, it's good to see you.
So you own and operate this company called Rough Draft Atlanta, which is a local news company in Georgia. We'll get to talking about everything there, but briefly, just to kind of talk about your background that kind of led up to you, basically becoming a local news entrepreneur. It seems like throughout your entire life, looking at your LinkedIn, looking at your resume, that you were jumping around in the media space, both in traditional journalism, but then also on the outside, like marketing and advertising tech and stuff like that. So like, what was kind of your initial interest and entry into media?
Yeah, well, the part that's probably not in my LinkedIn is that when I was a kid, we got 3 newspapers every morning at my house. So I grew up in a very news obsessive household. So much so that when I was a teenager, I personally used my allowance money to subscribe to the afternoon paper. So I grew up in a time when Atlanta had, in the morning, the Atlanta Constitution, and then in the evenings, the Atlanta Journal. So that was how cool I was in high school, is that I was rushing home to get the afternoon paper. I started working at WSB Radio, which is the flagship of news radio station in the Southeast and one of the top radio stations, in the country, part of Cox at the time. And I started working there when I was in high school. I just talked my way into an internship, and I would sit and just learned how to run the board, how to produce, how to edit, and ended up working really all through my senior year of high school, and then through college, producing Georgia games, the Braves, the Hawks, the Falcons, and then eventually was the morning show producer after college, and totally burnt myself out. I wanted to get into sales. I was tired of waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and being done with work at 11, which is not really an ideal lifestyle for someone that's 23 or 24 years old. So it was impossible for me to break into sales there because they had sort of saw me as this producer kid. So I ended up, getting my way to New York in 1999. And it was at the time when the first .com boom was happening, and all my friends were working at startups and there were parties every night, and they were making lots of money. And so I was able to, I think for the only time in my life, probably applied for a job without knowing anybody, just blindly applied on the internet at a company called Jupiter Communications, which was a research company where young at the time, or in this case, young people were writing research reports about how the internet was going to disrupt business, in particular media. And so I was on the sales side. So I was around a bunch of really smart people that were thinking about the future of media and digital media and what the internet would bring. And my role was to do sales in emerging markets. And so got an amazing experience where I was able to travel around the world. My first trip I took in that role was to India and then Singapore and Australia on that same trip. So I think for 2 years, the first 2 years I worked at Jupiter, I never took one domestic business trip. It was only flying around the world.
And you're just like pitching people on like why your research on media companies is essential for them to be able to do their jobs or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, this was so early days for the internet that everyone was just terrified of what the internet was going to do to their business, and so they would spend tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on market research to have access to speak to our analysts, to read the research reports, to get the data, to make decisions. So that that company no longer exists in that name, but pieces of it are at Gartner, pieces of it are at Forrester. So that was my first sales job, was selling that research.
And kind of like an interesting recurring theme when you were outside of media is you always kind of had one toe still dipped into it. So you were keeping educated and probably forming your own kind of opinions about what was going on in the media world once that was 1999. Obviously the next 10, 15, 20 years would bring a lot of, disruption and stuff like that. So you were always kind of on the edge of that, because after that, you then later went to work in like ad tech and marketing and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, always following, always studying media. And when I went to the University of Georgia, the Grady College of Journalism, and studied the business of media. My emphasis was on telecommunications management and the business minor. So I've always had that interest in what's happening. And then I joined Outbrain, and I worked there on the client side, so managing a client services team. And
client side as in the buyers or the publishing partners?
In both. So I was responsible for the teams that worked with both of those. We had two separate sides of the business, two different teams. One that would work with advertisers to help them maximize their reach and their ad spend, and then one that would work with publishers to help them maximize their revenue. So I got to sit over both of those,
which is a great perch, I think, to like really kind of see what's going on between those two sides and what the advertising side needs, and also like the troubles and the tribulations and the anxieties on the publishing side. It probably was a pretty good educational experience for someone who would later own a media company.
Yeah, for sure, and it gave me insight into both. I was not, I'm still probably not an expert on ad tech. I came into that role with a lot of client service experience and I think a lot of business experience and maturity that was good for the time, but I was not an ad tech expert. So learned a lot about ad tech and also learned a lot about the challenges that publishers face, which would later or now I think serves me well in my role of now owning a media company in Atlanta.
So you were living in New York. You decided to move back to Atlanta in what, 2019?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I bought a place here in 2018, and then I commuted for about a year and a half. I was traveling every week between New York and Atlanta, and Outbrain knew I wanted to be back in Atlanta, just for some family reasons. And so they were super supportive, had a pretty organized, almost year-long transition plan. So I left Outbrain the end of Q3 in 2019. So so I had been traveling internationally, needed to just hit pause for a second. So for the last 3 months of 2019, I was kind of doing nothing. I was consulting for a friend's company, just getting back in shape. I had bought a dog. I was, enjoying the cost of living differences between New York and Atlanta. And then I started looking around for something to do and wanted to be engaged locally. There's a lot of really interesting things that are happening in Atlanta politically, culturally. Just really felt like Atlanta was getting a lot more interesting. And so I was looking around at small businesses, and I met a guy who had a group of community newspapers, and he was turning 70, and he wanted to retire and didn't have a really clear succession plan. So when I met him, we hit it off personally. We had a lot of things in common, knew a lot of the same people, and we started talking, and I got really interested. And I thought, this sounds kind of cool. And I saw a bunch of things that I could do to make some changes. And then the pandemic happened. And I was like, whew, I dodged a bullet. And so we put the talks on hold. And obviously, as people like to say, the world stopped. And we stayed in touch through the summer, through the first phase of the pandemic. And then we started, he kind of weathered the storm. There was 1 month when they didn't print. And revenue, it was not a great revenue year for the company in 2020. And so they kind of weathered the storm. And so we started talking again at the end of the summer. And, by then I think I got some advantages on probably the cost, because things had, the business had taken a little bit of a turn. But I was still really interested, and I still thought my plan made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So I went to a bunch
Let's talk about what this company was. So this guy was like 70 years old. Over a span of years, he had either purchased or launched several print newspapers in and surrounding the Atlanta area in the suburbs, and these were monthly free newspapers that were mailed to people's mailboxes. Correct.
Correct.
Yeah.
And
So
they
they
were
were
98%, a little bit more than 98% print revenue.
Yeah, and so because they were completely free, they were monetized almost 100% through advertising, mainly through local mom and pop businesses and stuff like that. At that point,
Yeah, 100% advertising. So there was no reader revenue model at the time. All the content was free, and mostly mom and pop local businesses.
and it had like each newspaper, or not every single newspaper, but it had like some websites with it, but they were kind of publishing to the websites almost as like an afterthought after the print newspaper would get mailed out or something like that.
That's right. It was very much of a print first mentality. They had 3 different websites for representing kind of the 3 different newspaper groups that had been put together into this one company. So 3 different logins, 3 different ad servers, really kind of people operating in 3 different silos for the most part. So you had people that were, editorial on one of the papers wouldn't collaborate with the editorial on the other paper. There was some sales fiefdoms that people didn't really communicate with each other on. So yeah, operating in very siloed manner.
Yeah, and how was it staffed?
So there were 3 full-time journalists, and then about, I think, 3 or 4 full-time salespeople, an office manager, actually 3 full-time salespeople and an office manager, and a graphic designer who also acted as a tech guy.
Yeah. And just to kind of, I know you've told this anecdote before, but like just to kind of explain how little they were focused on digital, like they had like a long dormant Instagram account that would have been started by some intern. Like when you were kicking the tires of this place, like it was clear that they just didn't have like a very strong web strategy or anything like that.
Yeah, over 5 years and like a week of not posting on Instagram. And I asked them, surely there must be a strategy. And like you said, it turned out an intern had set up the password and they had lost it when the intern left. So in about, I don't know, less than 12 hours, I had reached out to someone that used to work for me at Outbrain, who was now at Facebook, and they had sorted the whole thing out. And so we went from, I think we had around 600 Instagram followers at that time. And just last week we passed 21,000. So we've completely, tried to reinvigorate the digital DNA of the company and move to being digital first. So you pointed out, like before it was very much like, let's get the print paper out the door and then we'll worry about digital. Now everything we do is digital first, and really newsletter first. So we think about every day is how do we program, how do we fill our morning newsletter so that is the new morning paper. So the visual I gave you of me getting 3 newspapers at our house every morning, like obviously that doesn't really exist much anymore. It's be pretty hard pressed to find someone that's getting 3 print papers delivered on a daily basis. But the newsletter for us and for a lot of people is obviously that's the new morning paper. And so that's what we think about as our daily goal.
So it's December 2020. The price has been shaved a little bit because the newspapers have cratered. So you basically pull together your own financing, right, to kind of acquire this entire company from this guy, right?
Exactly. So I was able to acquire the company and closed in December 2020. Self-financed, seller financed and self-financed. And so, yeah, I was able to do it. And then after we closed, the AJC, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, this guy named Bill Torpy, who's like the last of the old school Metro columnists, at least for Atlanta, he interviewed me. We spent about 90 minutes on the phone talking, and he wrote a column in which he said, I had to find out who this nut was that bought a newspaper company. It was very funny. It was very fair. And the next day or a couple of days later, I got an email from somebody very senior at Cox, and they said, I read Bill Torpy's column, and I need to know what you're doing. what do you know that we don't know, basically? So we met. And I said, I don't know. I said, I've got this plan. I think it could be a good one. Here's what I see. Very transparent. Anyway, that person has since become a mentor, introduced me around to leadership at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who's become a great partner of ours. So yeah, since then we've been kind of off to the races. I mean, the second month, so the first issue that was mine was January, and then the second issue that I owned, I guess, was February, and I think revenue dropped in February by like 20%, and I completely freaked out. Might have been around the time that we first spoke, because I was listening to all these industry podcasts, I was reading, and it just is doom and gloom everywhere. And so I was just thinking to myself, what have I done? But I had a plan. I knew where we could lean in. I had a good sense of what the community needed, what people would respond to. So since that point, we've been growing every quarter.
Hi there, Simon here. So that's the end of the free preview for this episode. If you want to listen to or watch the full episode, you have to become a paid subscriber to my Substack. When you subscribe, you get an automated email that allows you to book a half-hour introductory phone call with me. Subscribers also get the full-length interviews with some of the world's most successful media entrepreneurs. You can watch the video version, read the transcript, or upload the audio feed to your favorite podcast player. To subscribe, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com, or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter.